I have been searching.
Welcome to Following the Fire. Thanks for joining us on this journey through the wilderness. Just like Israel followed the pillar of fire and smoke, we want to take a new look at our beliefs and just follow him.
And like Israel, we get it wrong a lot, we get lost a lot, but we're doing our best to go where God leads us. I'm Nathan.
And I'm Steve.
Don't you know it's all I have? But even on my heart can't compare with what you're worth.
Hey everybody, welcome to the podcast. Today we have an exciting guest on, at least I think it's exciting because I'm kind of a nerd about this stuff. But we were thinking, it's one thing to pontificate about inerrancy and who wrote which books of the Bible and all that kind of stuff like we did the last couple episodes. It's another thing to get somebody on here who is an actual Bible scholar who really knows what they're doing and has translated ancient texts and all that kind of stuff. And so we have Trevor Thompson on. I've known Trevor for a long time. Went to Bible college together back at Oklahoma Christian University. But he has taken this stuff to the next level. And we're going to talk to Trevor today mostly about pseudepigraphic texts and what those mean and what that means for the Bible. So Trevor, why don't you start out by telling us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so my name is Trevor Thompson, and I'm a senior acquisitions editor at William B. Erdman's publishing company in Grand Rapids, Michigan, where I live with my family. I'm primarily responsible for the New Testament books at Erdman's, books in the Greco-Roman world, as well as I do some trade titles, some more popular titles as well, and actually facilitate the audiobook program that comes out of Erdman's. I grew up in western Oklahoma, in a small town called Clinton, where I was a Red Tornado.
Nice.
Did undergraduate work at Oklahoma Christian, and then a couple of master's degrees at Harding Graduate School of Theology, and another master's degree at the University of Chicago, and doctoral work at the University of Chicago. Yeah, I've published in a variety of different areas for encyclopedias, worked a lot on ancient authenticity criticism. I've done some work with the physician Galen. Actually had the chance to provide the first English translation of a text that had been miscatalogued and was discovered anew a couple of years ago.
Really? By Galen?
By Galen. It was called On Grief, or it's a fascinating little text. It's a letter reply to someone that describes a massive fire that swept through the heart of Rome and burned Galen's storehouses, which included medicinal books, pharmaceutical books, one-off medical instruments, things that he had made that were irreplaceable. And it's a philosophical treatise about why he did not suffer from or die from depression.
Wow.
We knew about the work. We just thought it had been lost. And then it turned out it was in a monastery in Thessaloniki and had simply been overlooked by the cataloger.
Wow.
And so, yeah, rediscovered by chance, and then got to work with translating that. And yeah, have written on ancient medicine for the online Oxford Encyclopedia, and yeah, fun stuff.
So you know lots of Greek stuff.
I do. Yeah, that's yeah. I actually was at the University of Chicago. I was the instructor of Koine Greek at the Divinity School, and then continued to teach Greek for a number of years when I was on staff at Abilene Christian University before coming to work for the press at Erdman's.
Yeah, I remember. So we were at OC in the Bible department roughly the same time, and
We were. Yeah.
And I remember you were like the go-to guy for anything Greek, even way back then. So
you're kind. So I look back on those days, and I think I knew too little and thought I knew too much, and so that's it's humbling. But yeah, but thank you.
Yeah, well, it's good to have you on. With the past couple episodes, it's kind of not really planned this way, but our last couple episodes have been kind of around the edges of the issues of inerrancy of the Bible, infallibility of the Bible, and kind of the source of things, the source of texts, where things came from.
Yeah.
And kind of how all that wraps up together. And I'm remembered that your Twitter handle is pseudepigraphos.
Pseudepigraphos, yeah.
Pseudepigraphos.
Yeah.
I can't say it the right way. I did pass Greek, but didn't do too well.
You're fine. You're fine. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, and so I thought, okay, I know that there are, at least apparently, there are some pseudepigraphic texts in the New Testament, theoretically? Or is it, I mean, I'm guessing on words here, but so if you could start out by telling us a little bit about what pseudepigrapha are, or that word.
Yeah.
And
No.
Go for
yeah,
that.
no, I'm happy to do that. I can kind of sort of take a running start if you want to kind of back up, because
start wherever you think would be best.
Yeah, so because the pseudepigraphy, I mean, literally means falsely inscribed, and so it's actually something that's falsely labeled, and so let me give you a non-biblical example. So there's kind of nothing at stake for anyone in terms of this. But going back to what I was saying about Galen, Galen is a 2nd century physician and lives in Rome. He's the court physician for Marcus Aurelius, and was actually responsible for part of Commodus's training. We can blame him for the monster that Commodus became. No, we can't do that. But he goes to the booksellers district of Rome, and someone is selling a book there, and it simply says of Galen, or Galens, we would say in English. And this scholar says, "Let me see it," and he picks it up, and he starts reading the first couple of lines, and he immediately says, "This isn't Galen," and he tears the top off, the part that said of Galen, and then gives it back to the guy who had purchased it, and basically said, "You got duped. You bought a pseudepigraphon from a forger in the booksellers district." And so the idea that you could write in somebody else's name for profit, to discredit them, to get yourself a wider audience, there are a whole number of reasons, and it's a huge phenomenon that has, it's not necessarily religious or just tied to New Testament studies, but is the ability to write in somebody else's name. He actually then goes through in that book, Galen does, in the book I was just mentioning to you. The book is called On My Own Books, and he talks about people sending him things all the time that have his name on them that he didn't write. And then other things that he did write that they'd written things into, etc. So the question then, so as applied to the Bible, then why does that matter? Well, a couple of things. So, and this gets to the kind of the inerrancy and infallibility thing, and then I'll move into pseudepigraphy. But I think for many people, in some meaningful sense, God is the author of the Bible. So you hear that phrase. That's it's a very simple but very tricky statement, right?
Yeah.
In the sense of what do you mean by author? But I would even push it further than that and say, what do you mean by Bible? Right, because it's not a self-evident object, and so when people say that, I don't think they mean Thomas Jefferson's Bible, right? Or I don't think they mean the King James Version, although some might. I don't think they mean Codex Sinaiticus or P46, the early collection of Paul's letters. It's some sort of concept, right? And so when you say the Bible is inerrant, or the Bible is infallible, or God is the author of the Bible, the problem is you really have to kind of pin down what you're talking about with the Bible and what the object of that is, because in reality, those theories and that claim, it's a claim about a theory about an object that doesn't exist.
Yeah.
I mean, kind of with me, like, so. You're making a claim, right, that there's this thing that happened about an object, and you can't go find this elusive Bible that is in that claim. Like, I mean, which one is it? I mean, is it the Greek version that Paul was using in Galatia without his letters? It's, which version, is it? So when you talk about pseudepigraphy, you kind of have to start at that kind of macro theological level, at least in church conversations.
Yeah.
Because if people are intimately tied to God as kind of a micromanager of the text of this Bible thing that you can clearly define, then talking about whether or not the people who say they're the author of a book, that they really were or weren't, gets dicey. But if you can be honest about the fact that we really don't have a Bible that we can say God inspired that one, or that one's infallible, or God is the author of that one, but really just a nebulous concept, it kind of gives you room to start thinking about authorship and how the books actually came to be. And I would even say that textual criticism, which its goal sometimes is to get back. When I was first taught textual criticism, actually back in my days at Oklahoma Christian, it was presented as we're going to get back to the originals, right?
Yeah.
The actual originals. Scholars don't think that's the case anymore. They sort of think that's I don't want to say a fool's errand, but they've replaced originals with earliest recoverable.
Right.
And so, for example, Paul's letters don't have dates on them.
Right.
Right. That's odd. And so are we actually dealing with this kind of an edited corpus even as we have it? Right. Like somebody went through and put them together and trimmed off some pieces. And so what are you actually, kind of reading in terms of all of that? So in terms of thinking about pseudepigraphy and the question of am I good, or do I need to slow down or anything? Or are we good? Like, I don't know if I'm just rattling along or.
Well, I'll jump in real quick because it's, this is fascinating. So we could probably do this with none of us saying anything, but I think one of the problems is that what you described is very, for these two groups of people, basically for non-academics, right? For people who grew up churched and believing,
Yep.
The way that you got the Bible then was kind of what you're talking about. It was handed to you. It was complete. We gave it a name with a capital B.
Right.
Here it is. And even for non-believers in non-academia, right, who have even less reason to care about what is this thing, kind of the intuitive understanding that many of my friends who are not believers came to is almost the same thing that a church person believes about the Bible.
Right.
This thing was handed to us as one work, and so then we work backwards and we kind of make it up, right? So I think there's a huge disconnect between, we're studying the Bible as Christians. We're not studying the study of the Bible.
Right.
And so this gulf between what academics, it's not threatening in that world.
Right.
That's this huge paradigm shift for a Sunday school kid to be like, wait a minute. You just said 5 things that I would like, what?
Right. Yeah. It is sort of the uber question. And in some ways I tie it to the larger question of what is God doing in the world? And there's another question, what is God doing with the book called the Bible?
Right.
And what is God's relationship with both of those entities? And those are complicated questions, right? Like, God's involvement in your own personal life faces problems when you have illness or sickness or tragedy. It faces problems when you think about the Holocaust, right? And these big questions. And so how you imagine God's relationship with the world and God's relationship with the book we call the Bible, in my opinion, should reflect what we actually know, not what we want to be true.
Yeah.
And so we know a lot about, for lack of a better phrase, what God has allowed with the Bible, right? And so the fact that in the 20th century, scholars concluded that, the final verses of the Gospel of Mark probably weren't in the earliest manuscripts, right? And that's fine. Okay, so it's a little note in the Bible, and actually there are multiple endings at the end of Mark. But it raises the larger question, like, well, how did it get in there? And why was it allowed to persist for hundreds of years if God is micromanaging a text?
Yeah.
And so that actual evidentiary base needs to inform whatever doctrine you have of inspiration or infallibility, because it may be the case that unlike the way I write a book or the way we work with a book at a press, where literally we control everything down to commas and periods and page breaks and indices, and we micromanage the whole thing. We want it to be perfect. There are occasionally errors slip through. That just happens with books. But it seems that God's relationship with the book we call the Bible is a little different, which allows to come full circle to the question that Steve asked me originally, and that is about the question of pseudepigraphy. And so the basic question is, are there books, let's just say the New Testament. The Old Testament is kind of a different thing in some ways, though there are similar issues there. But are there books, letters, etc., that are falsely inscribed in the New Testament? That is, they're attributed to some figure, but it's pretty clear for a variety of reasons that this or that book is not from that person. Before I answer that question, another caveat. There is no doubt that early Christians, broadly defined, were engaged in the writing of pseudepigraphic texts. That's not a question. So, for example, even in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, there's a reference about a random letter as though from us, which is this kind of very ambiguous, which has created all kinds of speculation through the centuries. Was somebody involved in a forgery at that early date, saying, hey, this is Paul's or something along the lines like that? But apart from that obscure reference, there's no question somebody wrote 3 Corinthians. It's a real text you can go read, right? Somebody decided that Paul and Seneca, the great philosopher, should have correspondence.
Really?
And they made up a whole body of literature that got taken as genuine in a lot of circles for a long period of time, where Paul and Seneca are writing back, and Seneca's praising Paul and how wonderful he is, and they're doing all this in Latin, of course, because that makes sense, I guess. No, or even better than that is the correspondence between Jesus himself and King Abgar, which is a king from the east that is quoted in Eusebius as genuine.
Really?
So you're talking about the 4th century. This great church, historian, everyone reads Eusebius. He has, and we have them. Because he quotes them, and so the question, and that's just the beginning of that. And so there are books now that have recently been published. Oxford did one. Erdman's has done 2 with New Testament Apocrypha, where you can go and read all of these texts. And so no one, to my knowledge, in the scholarly community considers 3 Corinthians to be a genuine letter of Paul, right? But it's there, and some people in the ancient church did. Same thing with Paul and Seneca, or Jesus and Abgar. I don't know of any real scholar that thinks Jesus and Abgar were actually pen pals. But Eusebius apparently did. And so that's, and so I say that to say that the early Christians were engaged in broadly writing texts in the names of other people, and whether they intended those texts to dupe people or not, they did.
So I want to ask you about that aspect of this stuff.
Yep.
I've been, over the past few years, I've been really trying to dig more into the historical and the cultural context of things in Scripture.
Yep.
And it informs lots of different ways of looking at things and things you never realized. Is this writing of pseudepigraphic texts, do we know from history and of the culture at the time, was it just like an accepted thing, like no big deal? Or was it like we would think of it now, like I'm plagiarizing in my paper for my class or something?
Yeah, it's not exactly plagiarism, and that's a really good question. The answer is yes and no. And it's often cited in literature that no one in the ancient world cared, right? That authorship is a modern construction, and there's a degree of truth of that. But there's a lot of counter evidence, like the example I just gave about Galen, that there are some people who did care. Galen cared if someone started writing in his name.
Yeah.
Because that's not how this is supposed to work. And Galen himself, for example, was very, very concerned that there were people who were making up books in the name of Hippocrates, the great physician of the past. And he went about to disprove them as pseudepigraphic texts and not Hippocratic, and spent a lot of his life proving that. And so it is clear that some people were very concerned. Depending upon how you understand 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 2, the letter as from us, whatever that's referring to, it seems that Paul in 2 Thessalonians, as the text comes to us, is concerned that maybe there's literature in his name that's not his. Now, with that said, there seems in some philosophical schools to have been a little more give of being able to write in the name of a deceased founder or something. That sort of, what would so-and-so have said in such a situation? The problem with thinking about those texts and the question of deception, which I think is what you're kind of getting at, Steve, a little bit, is that even if you compose a text and it is glaringly transparent to you and maybe the immediate people around you that this is not real, right? This is not actually from so-and-so. It doesn't take long for texts to take on a life of their own. And apart from the intent of the producer, they become objects of deception because somebody else doesn't figure it out at that second step or third step. And so even if, a buddy and I, sat around and we're like, what would Epicurus have said about this? And we know he didn't write this. You pass it down a couple of generations and, oh, look what Epicurus wrote, and the memory gets lost. Now, whether or not people would have been upset about it may or may not have, kind of depended on whether they liked the interpretation of Epicurus. And that's an important point too, is that in the ancient world, challenging the authenticity of a document was a practice first really honed in law courts, right, for wills. Just like, right. I mean, so like if you could prove
the money.
Exactly. If you could prove so-and-so didn't actually want this will, right? And so you learn a set of skills in school that allowed you to enter into a law court setting and challenge a will. You could use those same skills if you wanted to say so-and-so didn't write this or that. So focus in on the New Testament. And let me give two concrete examples of the sort of lowest hanging fruit in terms of the pseudepigraphy question. The first is 2 Peter. And 2 Peter is, as I've told students for years, and I still adjunct and teach, actually taught today, a local university as an adjunct. I tell students 2 Peter is probably the luckiest book in the New Testament to have survived. Because 2 Peter first appears kind of out of nowhere in the middle to late 2nd century, which is, of course, years. I mean, you're talking, long time after the purported death of Peter in the middle of the 1st century. And the first mentions of it raise questions about where did it come from, who's using it. And in other words, like it sort of pops its literary head into the conscience of historians under a cloud of suspicion, even among the ancients. And that continues in the 2nd, the 3rd, and into the 4th century. There are people who don't think it's from Peter. There's really good reason to think that. And so I used to teach 1st and 2nd year Greek, and one of the capstone texts we would read is 2 Peter. And my students started to refer to it as Satan. The text itself, it is rhetorically rich, very complicated. It's actually good Greek, which most of the New Testament is not. But it's at this entirely different register, even of 1 Peter, right? Apart from the fact of who Peter actually was, which there's a couple of moves of Peter is known from the Gospels to literary Peter of 1 Peter, which is a pretty big educational jump, to 2 Peter, which is on a whole nother plane. And so for me, so for example, at the press, when we think about different authors of different books and different commentary series, kind of figuring out where an author stands on the authenticity of 2 Peter is a sort of shibboleth. If they think Peter wrote 2 Peter, then the questions of pseudepigraphy, for whatever reason, for faith, institutional commitment, whatever, are pretty much off the table in terms of pseudepigraphy in the New Testament. Because, even conservative scholars are hard-pressed to say, yeah, I think Peter of the Gospels, follower of Jesus, disciple, was literarily responsible for the product of Second Peter. And so, and again, I mean, it's a variety of things. It's the fact that it appears out of nowhere years after the purported author dies. The language is on a totally different register. The rhetoric is on a totally different register. The worldview, I mean, in terms of the way it conceptualizes the universe, it's like this alien thing. Unfortunately, when English translations occur, there's a leveling. And so every translation has like a target level. The NIV, I think, is like 7th grade or something like that. 7th or 8th grade is like the target. So all of the difficulty of making sense of 2 Peter in Greek is completely obliterated for your English reader. So someone listening to this may go, well, I have no problem reading 2 Peter. I just flip it right. Well, that's because scholars took it, and made it so it seems easy. But the Greek text itself is very complicated. Another example is the book of Revelation itself. And actually, one of the most detailed examples we have of an ancient author going after the authenticity of a text is the book of Revelation by Dionysius of Alexandria. He goes word by word and breaks apart that the person who wrote the Apocalypse could not have been the person that wrote the Gospel, which is how traditionally in church they were linked. Now, he did all of that for a reason. It wasn't just he just wanted to sit around and just have an academic exercise and wonder who wrote Revelation. He didn't like the book. He didn't like the eschatology. He didn't like the eschatology in the book. He didn't like the violence in the book. And so he thought if he could use his education and sort of put a break between those two, that whoever the John was of Revelation could just go away. And again, he seems to have been successful. I mean, for at least 100+ years in segments of the church of kind of getting Revelation off the table. Now, ultimately, as we know, as the canon got solidified and formed in Bibles today, it made it in. But those are two of the kind of, whenever I have conversations with scholars and kind of want to figure out where they are on the question of pseudepigraphy, or when I teach students, those are the two examples I always start with before you move to more complicated sort of things. And so in terms of New Testament pseudepigraphy, those are the two lowest hanging fruits. And I'll punt it back to you to follow up, push, or ask me to say something more.
That's a lot. I'm just loving. I'm loving the thought process of it all.
Yeah, I think maybe I'm still interested in that idea of what biblical academics have accepted and why it's so different from what a civilian, maybe even minister, is going to know or be aware of, because we have ministry training, right? And then there's academics. And I think that even current culture aside, there's some skeptical feelings about like, what are they doing in those ivory towers? Mm-hmm. And you know what I mean? So I think that I think that one question that would help people is why is this study important, and what does it bring to the church? Mm-hmm. And or maybe why is that bridge there? Why the disconnect?
Yeah, there's a number of ways to answer that, and I'll say it in this way: a religious person without doubt is a dangerous person.
Oh, that's good. It's true. Yeah.
It just in general. The question you're posing, Nathan, which is a good one, is why would Joe or Jeanette Christian care? Right? Why would they care about any of this?
Yeah.
Let me rephrase it a little bit. Let me rephrase the question. Imagine a boy or girl raised 50 miles down the Nile today, who, let's say, has some training, learns to read the Quran, and then they head to Cairo, university scholarship or whatever. And the question becomes, what would we want or expect their training about Islam and the Quran to be in Cairo versus what maybe they learned in their village, down the Nile. On the one hand, the university could teach them Orthodox Islam, which today, as it's expressed, is that the Quran itself has never been changed. That if you buy the Quran, what you're actually reading are the actual exact words that were delivered to the Prophet Muhammad. And I don't want to get into all the details of this because this gets kind of dicey. Or would you want them to know that the history of the Quran is a little more complicated than maybe you learned in the village?
Mm-hmm.
Right? And let's talk a little bit about variance, things that are a little different in different versions of the Quran. Again, that very much goes against Orthodox Islam. For me, history creates a window to understand the human experience and God's interaction with the human experience in new and better ways. It facilitates doubt, which creates room for faith that certainty doesn't.
Mm.
And part of the payoff for me, and I'll just speak personally, of academic study of the Bible in its various languages and iterations, etc., is that the Bible ceased to be the object of my faith.
Yeah.
Which, if I'm frank, raised in a little church in western Oklahoma next to a wheat field, transitioning then to Oklahoma Christian and other institutions, my belief structure really was oriented in a book. And so understanding the history of that book allowed me to remove it as an idol and discover God.
It's so interesting because as people who came out of a Protestant and then whatever else faith, we had already done that to the church.
Mm-hmm.
So we are very used to understanding the history of the church,
mm-hmm.
which has, if you're talking about God micromanaging events, has a lot of mistakes in it, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
That you would say, you either have to challenge what you think God is doing, or you have to face those mistakes or those problems or those black parts of history in the church.
Right.
But as Protestants, we don't think of the church as holy,
right,
or handed down to us, right, by God, and so we're
mm-hmm.
used to being able to look at that, and it's not threatening at all because I'm not standing on that pillar.
Right.
And I think you're exactly right that so many of us are standing on this pillar of a specific way of thinking about the Bible,
mm-hmm.
that it's kind of an unapproachable.
Well, it's. And I'm going to be careful the way I use this word, but in the same way that there are mythical theories that exist in the world about the Quran, there are very popular mythical theories about the Bible.
Right.
Yeah.
And so what I would say is that, and this is the second point of the analogy I was using earlier, of the image, is that part of being a good global neighbor is being willing to ask the hard questions about your own religion and your own religious texts and dealing with the gray that results as a way of engaging conversation with those in another tradition. It's sort of if you can't see what's in your own eye, you're going to have difficulty doing that. And so for me, honest academic study of sacred texts is an open door for humility and conversation across religious traditions and mutual understanding, and ultimately faith. In terms of your other question about, okay, so what do academics think? Let's just take the letters of Paul. Okay, so if I go to the Society of Biblical Literature meeting, the national meeting, and I present an Pauline epistles section, which I've done in the past, they are not going to grant you just off the bat that all of the letters that have Paul's name on them are from Paul. That's not a starting point. Half the people in the room or more, it's hard to know the exact numbers, they're not going to accept 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus as being from Paul, the pastorals. They're not going to accept Ephesians as being from Paul. Colossians itself is kind of suspect for a lot of people, though there's arguments that happen around that. The letters that and 2 Thessalonians actually is another letter that ends up in the mix. And so of the 13, you have 6 that are disputed, that are not just fair game for you as a scholar to stand up and just start citing, as Paul says in Ephesians, or Paul says in 1 Timothy or 1 Timothy. That's not going to be granted to you. If you want to cite Romans, fine. 1 Corinthians, fine. Philemon, fine. 1 Thessalonians, fine. But those other disputed texts become a little more dicey. Things are more complicated with 2 Corinthians, which, depending upon the scholar you ask, is either 1, 3, 5, or 7 different letters that have all been smashed together. But that's probably for another podcast and another discussion about how that happened. In terms of the authorship of the other books, so Paul's a huge chunk, right? And I also should say historically, Paul was certainly credited with 14 letters. And so if you pull out an original King James version, the 1611 King James, although not in the text, in the title, it's Paul. Mm-hmm. So Hebrews is unquestionably, some of us learn that as kids and then get to college and someone goes, by the way, Paul's name's actually not in Hebrews. And you're like, oh, what's going on there? But through most of Christian history, 7 times 2, 7's an important biblical number, 14, that's the Pauline corpus, which is 14 of 27. Modern scholars grant 7 of the original 14, though even conservative scholars now would say, well, Hebrews, it's not Paul. It doesn't say it's by Paul, so why are we arguing about this? It's just somebody put that above it. A pseudepigraphic. That, as I've told people before, they'll say to me, Hebrews is not a pseudepigraphon. And I say to them, I understand what you're saying. If you read it in Greek, have a Greek Bible in front of you. But in the 1611 King James, it is a pseudepigraphon. Right above Hebrews, it is falsely inscribed. Right. The letter of Paul to the Hebrews. That's the definition of a pseudepigraphon. Falsely attributed.
Right. There's the author claiming to be someone else, but then there's the understanding, regardless of what the author said, of this came to us from
so and so. And so the editors of the 1611 King James, and they just didn't make this up. This was a tradition they inherited, but it's a pseudepigraphon there. In terms of other texts, the book of Revelation, very curious. Who is this John character? How is this John character related to the other Johns, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, or the author of the Gospel of John? Not to mention the enigmatic we of John chapter 21 that seems to be different than the rest of the book. But scholars remain agnostic, confused about who exactly is the author of the Gospels. And this gets into some really difficult questions about eyewitnesses and proximity to the disciples and where did the titles of the Gospels come from. But there is literally endless debate. Just for example, like what is the relationship of the Gospel of Matthew to Matthew? And if Matthew is a close disciple, but Mark is not, if, as most scholars believe, though that we're reassessing the synoptic problem constantly, the relationship of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, if Matthew's a close disciple, why is he copying Mark?
Yeah.
Or did somebody decide we need to attribute this to Mark or Matthew to kind of give it more authority? And those are complicated questions about where did the Gospels come from? Who's ultimately responsible for them? That also applies to the book of Acts. I've already mentioned 2 Peter. 1 Peter itself is a bit of a problem, not as much of a problem as 2 Peter, but it's a problem. The relationship of Jude and 2 Peter is a real problem. They seem to have a literary relationship, which most people think means whoever wrote 2 Peter in the name of Peter had Jude, which is the general consensus. Now, there's different ways of solving that problem. You could say they had something else, and Jude and the author of 2 Peter had the same source. That's another way of doing that. But yeah, so the question of pseudepigraphy is really, really live within the 27 books accepted in the Bible, the canonical New Testament, not to mention all the stuff beyond, which I've just mentioned, the sort of tip of the iceberg, 3 Corinthians, Paul and Seneca, that kind of stuff.
Something I just thought of history's, this is textual criticism, but you also mentioned history. Mm-hmm. And history is the study where the source is further and further away from us as each year goes on, but it's still possible to discover new things about something 2,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, because of either, like you mentioned, a new text that of Galen, or just better better knowledge of Greek, better study. I think there's this scary thing about new things, or like, it shouldn't be possible to discover new things, but what topics are new, or like what things are kind of being discovered this decade that were kind of unknown to Christian scholarship? Are some of these things, are they evolving that quickly, or are you in discussion with people from 1,000 years ago and from 500 years ago?
Right. So biblical scholarship or historical scholarship or even Christian scholarship, really, it is a lot of conversations with the deceased, right? And it's how those deceased speak into the present, and whether that's through material culture that they leave behind or through text and translation. And so scholars are forever, we recently had some discoveries of some of Origen, for example, which had been lost. And so, we're adding to the library of Origen. So there's this kind of constant kind of work going on. There's for the longest time, there was all of this excitement about a so-called first century version of the Gospel of Mark that turned out to be a total falsehood. But it floated around for about 10 years, that there was this mystery thing that was going to be revealed, Mark from the first century, and it turned out that it was kind of a mess, and I won't go into all of the details of that. Of course, about the forgery of the Gospel of Jesus' wife, the so-called Gospel of Jesus' wife, right? And so things do pop up, and some of them are genuine, some of them are forgeries. It's not just an ancient practice. It's a modern practice as well, so you kind of have to vet and sort that out. In terms of biblical scholarship writ large, the primary shift that I would say, and I don't know if this is the question you want, Nathan, but in terms of what scholars are doing today, is that we are reaching a turning point, which is good, in which biblical scholarship, at least in the Western sense, is no longer being controlled by white male men. And so women and persons of color are approaching the text, and they're asking different questions about the text, and the agendas and the questions of white men are no longer driving the train. And that happens in a lot of subtle ways. So for example, a very simple, Lynn Osiak raised a question some years ago, and this is the kind of thing that white men just missed, but it raised the simple question: what would it have been like to have been a slave girl to a non-Christian master, and hear in a Christian setting two different commands? Avoid porneia, right, sexual immorality, on the one hand, and on the other hand, obey your master. Those two things. Yeah. Right. And for reasons you can probably imagine, not a lot of white male scholars went, that's a problem.
Right.
and so there's been a diversification of voices, which has raised new questions about Christian origins and about the texts. And I was just talking to a bright scholar today who's working on a project about thinking through the ways in which, for example, when Jesus turns over all of the, in the temple, the scene with the whips and turning the money table over, who was manning those tables? Were those slaves? And did they get in trouble because somebody messed up all the money? Right, which is it's sort of a decentering of the story, right?
Yeah,
it's a triumphant story of Jesus. Get rid of the greed, whatever. But are there real world impacts on people at a lower socioeconomic or lower power level in those stories? And so those are some of the questions that scholars are asking. And there's been a big turn of late of thinking about the physical texts of how the Gospels were composed, who used them, who read them, how they got brought together, etc.
So when it comes to looking through, I mean, you sit down to look through the New Testament as a scholar, and you identify these texts that are either pseudepigraphic or, whether like then or now, like you mentioned with the KJV,
right?
And you determine that this 2 Thessalonians, for example, that maybe that's probably not Paul.
Right.
That obviously that opens a can of worms, because it goes back to kind of Nathan's question of scholarship versus, for lack of a better phrase, blind faith. Like it's in my Bible, it's supposed to be there.
Yep.
I saw a video just recently of a gal like really, really concerned and disheartened that I think it was like Matthew 17:21, I forget the exact verse, is like verse 21 is not in the Bible because it wasn't in the KJV, but the newer text and all this stuff, and she was shaking her faith.
Right.
And so but then you get to talking about entire books,
right,
and it becomes less of to a lot of people, it becomes less of a scholarship issue and more of just a faith issue. So how do you approach that?
Yeah, I mean, no,
easy question, right?
yeah. So the fact that an adult who has invested enormous time and resources to attend church and read a Bible across their life, right, can discover. I used to play this game with my students called "Find That Verse." And I show all these verses, and there are a lot of them that just don't exist in modern translations because they've been decided. Yeah. It's been decided on very good grounds that they should not be, in the text. Not just the big chunks like the woman caught in adultery, in John 8 or Mark 16, but there's all the little verses here and there in different places. And so the fact that they don't know that when it's clearly printed, I mean, even if you go to Bible Gateway online or your phone app, there'll be a little star or an asterisk or something that will tell you, hey, listen, there's a verse missing here and the earliest manuscripts don't have. To me, and again, using my analogy about what does it mean to be a good neighbor, if Christians don't understand the basics of how the book came to be and sort of the reality of that, how can you expect someone else from another tradition, maybe with fewer educational opportunities, less access to information? How can you expect them? And so, first of all, I think it's not neighborly to kind of be ignorant like that. Second, I think it is a failure of church leaderships and church educational programs that kids show up at college, a Christian college. So these are, obviously parents are invested, and they just don't know really, really basic things, and that's easily remedied. For me, if they can get past that first hurdle of, okay, we're removing Mark, 16:9 through the end of the thing, there is a question of, do you just remove it? Do you leave it? Do you put do you put a little squiggly line around it? Like, what do you do with it? Then moving to say, okay, well, maybe this book, not by Paul. That creates an opportunity for a broader discussion about what is the canon, who decides what's in and out, which I'm going to be honest here again, that itself can be pretty unsettling.
Yeah.
Because ultimately publishers publish Bibles, and they publish Bibles so people will buy them.
Yeah.
To make money. I mean, like the whole controversy, the two of you may recall, over the TNIV, which no longer exists. You can't get the TNIV, right?
What is the TNIV?
Today's NIV or something.
Yeah. It was an attempt to revise the NIV that caught the ire of some very, very powerful people in the evangelical world for issues of gender-inclusive language.
Okay, that's ringing a bell. Yeah.
The committee, and this is what's fascinating, right? The committee, which worked for the publisher, formally repented.
Really?
They pulled the TNIV. To my knowledge, you cannot go and purchase a TNIV today. I mean, you may be able to get an old used copy.
Huh.
And they went back and redid the NIV without the TNIV problems. And so now the new NIV is actually the new NIV, and if you refer to the old NIV, that's the NIV of 1977.
Yeah.
when the New Testament was done. But there is a larger question of who's actually in charge of your Bible, and who's making the decisions to separate texts that are lost. Who decides just to cut that verse and put it in a note? Or who decides just to leave 2 Thessalonians? And frankly, this is a pretty serious problem for Protestants because we don't have a ready answer. Right.
I was about to say, for the days when we were just one giant church, right? When the Catholic Church was in charge. Yeah.
Right. I mean, there is a simplicity and a beauty, in that, the Roman Catholic Church decides, and these are the books. The Protestant model of tying it to apostles and authority and trying to distance it from the church, things do get a little bit more tenuous. Now, you can be creative and find meaning in these pseudepigraphic texts. You can think about how other people have used them across time and space and find meaning in them that way. Now, whether or not, like 2 Thessalonians, I personally like the fact that it's disputed because 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 is one of the weirdest chapters in the entire Bible, and it actually credits God theologically with causing people to believe lies.
And
so the pastorals say some really, really worse than disheartening, really bad things about women, and things that I don't like and I don't agree with and are not experiences of my life or my educational trajectory. And so hanging the Deutero-Pauline label on those texts is good for me. Now, for other people, who really like, elder lists or, whatever, it's maybe a little more problematic, but not for me. And so in general, I would say churches and institutions of higher education that are financed by churches and church people need to do a better job of being honest and communicating clearly about what's going on here. It should not be the case that an 18, 19-year-old rolls into a Christian college and learns some of this stuff for the first time. I mean, all of the people that I've ever talked to who talk about faith development and trajectories of spiritual growth and all that kind of stuff, not my area of expertise. I don't claim any expertise here. But they've all said that there should be a transition, those that I've talked to, at like ages 16, 17, and 18, when one is still at home, so to speak, where in some kind of context there starts to be a maturation, a presentation of more complicated materials.
That makes so much sense because otherwise it's like everything that these authority figures taught me is being challenged instead of these people who lived it out that I saw also, grapple with this. So maybe there's room for me to grapple with that as well. That's such a good point.
Yeah, but of course that requires the adult in the situation to also actually want to grapple with those things.
Yeah.
Right. And
which is often not the case.
That's that's part of the problem. And that's, really, really, really part of the problem. I mean, I remember asking Steve back at OC days, we, for some reason I don't remember what class I was even in, but it was the Battle of Jericho. And I remember raising my hand and I said, "This is genocide." and
yes, and
the professor, I'll leave the name out, was like, "What?" I said, "This is genocide. I mean, they're killing everything. I mean, like you read these stories." And I said, "You know what's worse is I acted this out at VBS 8 years ago."
As a 10-year-old.
Right. I walked around the Battle of Jericho with these fake bricks in the auditorium, and everybody died. And why are we doing this? But if people in churches don't stop and ask these questions, then you end up with young adults who, with just a small amount of information, it just tailspins.
When I even remember also in a class at OC with Kurt Nickham, actually. Love the guy.
Yeah, I love him too.
It was my Romans class, and somebody asked a really, like a question I forget the exact question, but it was a really hard question. And he's like, "Can somebody go grab the doors?" Shut the doors, please. And he's like, okay, here's the real talk, you know?
Yeah.
And the fact that is, even at a university that's supposed to be teaching you about the Bible, the fact that some of that stuff is, the questions are seen as not permissible to ask.
Right. Or answer.
That causes a lot, or answer, that it causes a lot of issues.
Yeah. No, I mean, I can go on and on and on about why I'm now working for a publisher and no longer working for a Christian university along these lines. But
I can imagine
that would be an entirely another podcast. But yeah, I mean, if you don't create the open space for the conversation, and people who are in charge don't know, then young people are not going to know.
Yeah.
It's definitely back to that space between faith as a holding tight to certainty, or faith as the letting go and, with doubt, with room for grief and doubt and, fear and uncertainty.
I mean, living in the gray is the space of faith.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I love what you mentioned earlier about how this is a lot. Doing this research and this learning and study has allowed you to, I think you said, remove the Bible as your focus of faith or focus of worship.
It was an idol.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I totally right there with you.
Yeah. I mean, it was a totem, an idol, you name it.
Yep. But allowing you to get to that point where, and that's kind of, I love how you said that, because that's really what I'm feeling. That's, I think, why I'm kind of going down this rabbit hole myself in a lot of ways. And I kind of have been for a while, off and on, but just not like afraid to say anything. Like
right.
I read a couple books by Bart Ehrman.
Bart Ehrman, yeah.
And I'm like, can I ask anybody about these things?
Yeah.
I'm like, I'm not allowed. This is scary stuff,
Yeah, no, I mean, Bart's books and the popularity of those books have been an entree for so many people to ask just basic questions. And, I mean, Bart himself is a former fundamentalist. I mean, this is his own, account, and he does a good job of raising a lot of the issues. The fact that some of the basic stuff that he raises, which frankly, again, is sort of New Testament or Bible 101 at most state school university introduction to the Bible courses, and is so shocking, says something about the church educational systems and even the Christian college educational systems. Like, why do you not know this? Well, no one told me. And so here's this person who's like, let me just tell you the truth, and again, history, you don't have to be afraid of history. I mean, for me, faith and the world of faith should be shaped by things we know, not by the world we hope to be true.
I like that.
Fantasy is the world of children. Reality is the world of adults. It's messy. And it's not the way, whatever God is doing with the book we call the Bible is not how I would write a book or publish one, frankly.
So do you just toss the whole thing out then?
No, it's just that it's just a moment of humility, that in the same way I wouldn't allow this, that, or the other in the world, but it's here. You sort of step back.
Yeah.
And it's kind of, it can be kind of a Job moment. When God in the story of Job, is presented in the story of Job, goes at Job and says, let's talk about Leviathan.
Yeah.
What do you got? And then, there's no question about, is Leviathan real? Like, in the mythical world, right, of that story, like, Leviathan's real, Behemoth is real. And God's like, you want to explain all this? And Job's like, I got nothing for you here. And so, that's what I mean by the humility of it and the taking down of certainty. So for me, the biblical text, when used in Christian community, is one of the primary dialogue partners of the church as it orients itself and thinks about itself. I rarely consider it the final word. It's an important part of the dialogue, but the Bible says enough different things and can be interpreted enough different ways and has enough historical problems that you have to use it wisely and not as a weapon of mass destruction.
Yeah, which it quite literally has been used as.
Literally.
Unfortunately.
Yep, for sure.
What you said earlier, I feel like it's less threatening to think about, like even thinking about the Quran, I was like, man, this is touchy. But
Yep.
you just, said, talking about things that, how did you not know this? Or like this little thing crumbles this whole thing. And it reminds me of talking to Chinese students or going to a culture that has a really locked down self-story about its country or its leader.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Or even its news, right? And so then there's, from the outside, it's like, why aren't you grappling with this? And we have that in America, the stories we have that to some extent. But at the root of that is insecurity. Like if you know the truth, then you will maybe not be as devoted to this country, and at the root of it, it's fear when you boil it down.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that holding on, it feels like you're protecting yourself from something, but it's evidence that you're afraid to look at this. And if you're afraid to look at this, then why is it your pillar? Why is it your final word on things?
Right.
When really at the heart of it is, I would rather not know these things, or even, even if you disagree with them or you want to find your own scholarship or whatever it is, I think there's even the reluctance to like even open that door. Like I joke, and I joked earlier, like genetic testing. Like, do you know what? Maybe some people shouldn't open that door. Like don't even want to go down that road.
Right.
But when it's the Bible, bigger things are at stake.
Yeah, and it actually kind of come full circle. I mean, genetic testing is an interesting thing because you may find out through a genetic test that a parent is not who you thought they were, but you may also through that same genetic test find a whole bunch of actual family members that explains a lot of things that are physically wrong with you. Right?
Yeah, and there's a difference between the truth and the story that you tell yourselves, right? But it doesn't, like discovering it doesn't change the truth. Right. Discovering, looking, this isn't quantum physics. Looking at it does not change the answer. It doesn't make it disappear.
Right. And ultimately, believing a story, if the story is not actually real, doesn't ultimately help you. When Steve and I were at Oklahoma Christian together, if he would have asked me, I would have told him to the point of like fighting that I was 1/16 Native American because of a family story. Now,
hey, I am Nathan, too. So I don't know if I want to hear this.
So I think everybody
Nathan,
is.
Yeah. So Nathan, I mean, you don't know, but I'm a 6'4" guy that looks like he's dropped straight out of like Sweden or Norway or something. Yeah. Like, I mean, I'm like sandy blonde hair. And so I finally took the test. And do you know what my percentage of Native American is?
What?
None.
0.
None. And so this is actually maybe a good place to kind of wrap our conversation. But when I was teaching at Abilene Christian, we had a class of 50 students, and we got permission from the provost. We were talking about family stories versus the reality of family, the stories we tell ourselves. And we asked all 50 students, ask your parents, what's the family story? And it was something like 48 or 49, I forget which one it was, of the students in that class believed they were Native American. Usually at the level of great, right? Or great or something like that.
Yeah.
Yep.
And
Native American princess, right?
Exactly. Or there was some noble whatever with grandpa. Yeah. It's all this kind of weird, legend. Do you know how many of those kids were Native American when the test came back? 1. And here's the kicker. Do you know who that one kid was? Yeah. That kid was from Mexico. And it totally destroyed his family's narrative.
No.
That he was pure Spanish blood from Spain in Mexico, never touched by indigenous populations, when in fact he was half Native American.
Wow.
Everybody's stories was blown up. And so the thing is that, and as applied to biblical studies, that's scary, but basically we all were living a lie. And not to be cliched, that the truth will set you free, but knowing things can allow you to live in truth and can allow you, in my case, to return it back, to actually find faith.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I feel like we need a few more episodes with you, Trevor.
Sure. I'm happy to help.
But yeah, the function of fear in religion and belief, I think, is something I want to talk about. Or I want to look into this more, because a lot of what we're talking about comes down to fear.
Right.
Fear. I'm afraid to look at what's true because I might know more than I want to know, and it's like there's this feeling that I know that's out there, and so we go to extremes to pre-discredit the sources before we even look into them. Mm-hmm. Like, well, they just hate God, so they want to pretend that the Bible's all fake and all that kind of stuff. And I'm sure you've received your help.
I have
plenty of that. So anyway, yeah, I could talk for a long time about this stuff, but I thank you so much for coming on to talk about this. We kind of branched all around from starting with pseudepigraphic texts, but
we did.
I think this is all really good stuff. I was wondering if you had a couple recommendations possibly for books that people might be able to like dig into this a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, if you go on Amazon and you search New Testament Apocrypha or New Testament Pseudepigrapha, as I mentioned, Oxford has produced some books where just in English translation where you can easily read this stuff, and Erdman's, the publishing house where I published, has produced 2 volumes of New Testament Apocrypha, Pseudepigrapha. These are, of course, books outside of the canon.
Right.
But if you want a sense of kind of what's there, or you yourself, you want to read, what did whoever church father, what did they think Seneca and Paul talked about? It's right there. Right. Or Jesus and King Abgar. And so, I mean, again, and it's not a question of whether Christians were doing this. They were. The question, which is a faith question tied to the authorship question, tied to the inspiration question, is whether there are pseudepigraphic texts in the New Testament. And so most biblical scholars say yes. I think they're right. Certainly in the case of 2 Peter, things get more dicey as you move further away from there in terms of who agrees or disagrees.
Are there any good sources for people to look into that kind of stuff? Like New Testament related things?
Yeah, I mean, just trying to think
just
through.
Like too broad?
Are the words too long? Are there sources with short words?
No. I mean, most good New Testament introductions talk about pseudepigraphy in some capacity, because you really have to. So there's a really good book, actually by Jerry Sumney, who's a guy from our tradition. It's in its third edition. It's called The Bible. It's Introduction to the Entire Bible. It's actually published by a frenemy press, by Fortress Press, but it's a good book and kind of talks through some of the issues of inspirations at an undergraduate level, and kind of gives you some options, as well as talks about pseudepigraphy. And so it's the book I use when I'm asked to teach freshmen and sophomores at the undergraduate level, usually at religious-based institutions, to sort of get their head around. It's written at that level, It's very, very accessible, but it's good.
Thank you. This has been great. I agree with Steve. Love to have you on again sometime. We could certainly fill an hour of questions. So thanks so much.
Sure, it's been my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
See you later.
These
Bye, guys.
messages I thought you wanted to hear, but it only takes a whisper.
Hey, thanks for listening to Following the Fire. If you'd like to see show notes for this episode, which includes links to everything we mentioned as well as all the scriptures, head on over to followingthefire.com and just click on this episode. There's also contact information on the website. Let us know what you think about the show and if you have any suggestions for future topics. Also, please give us a review on Apple Podcasts if you could. It really helps other folks find the show. And as always, thanks to the fabulous Daniel Wheat for the theme song and the music for the episode. You can find more of his stuff on Apple Music and Spotify. See you later.